Why energy, compliance, and supply chain pressure are all landing at the same time. If your organization feels like it is managing three separate crises that used to arrive one at a time, that observation is accurate. Energy cost and availability pressures, compliance obligations, and supply chain accountability demands have each been building on their own track for years. What changed in 2026 is that all three arrived at the same time. Understanding why that happened is more useful than treating them as separate problems, because the organizations navigating this well are the ones that stopped doing exactly that. They were always connected. The pressure just made it obvious. Energy, compliance, and supply chain are not three independent categories of corporate concern. They are three expressions of the same underlying dynamic: the cost and complexity of operating in a world where physical infrastructure, regulatory frameworks, and global sourcing networks are all under simultaneous strain. Peak power demand could increase 26% by 2035 VV, driven by the rapid growth of data centers and electrification, described as the most rapid increase seen in the power sector in the last 30 years, adding substantial new load to a grid that is already stretched thin. That demand surge does not stay inside the energy category. It drives up energy costs for industrial and commercial users. It strains the same grid infrastructure that supply chain logistics depend on. And it creates compliance complexity as emissions tied to purchased electricity become harder to report accurately when the grid mix is shifting faster than annual disclosure cycles can track. More than 70% of U.S. companies across oil and gas, power generation, and other major subsectors identify grid and infrastructure limitations as their most significant barrier, the highest level of concern recorded globally. When more than 7 in 10 U.S. companies point to the same structural constraint, it is no longer a sector-specific issue. It is a cross-functional operating reality that touches capital planning, procurement, and compliance simultaneously. Compliance complexity did not grow in a vacuum. The compliance environment in 2026 is genuinely harder than it was 2 years ago, and not simply because new rules arrived. It is harder because the rules are arriving from multiple directions at once: federal, state, and international, with different scopes, different timelines, and in some cases, directly conflicting obligations. The One Big Beautiful Bill Act shortened qualification windows for wind and solar credits, imposed new foreign entity of concern sourcing restrictions, and compressed developer timelines, increasing compliance needs across the energy value chain. For companies with renewable energy procurement agreements or clean energy capital programs, those changes created immediate contract and sourcing questions that did not exist 18 months ago. At the state level, GHG reporting deadline carries real operational weight, regardless of ongoing litigation. The data systems, internal controls, and cross-functional coordination it requires are the same ones that supply chain carbon documentation, investor disclosure requests, and buyer emissions requirements are all pulling toward. Companies that built those systems early are finding they serve multiple purposes. Ones that did not are finding that multiple obligations arrived before the infrastructure to meet them did. Legal and compliance teams are operating in an environment where policy shifts can materially alter contract rights, pricing models, investment strategies, and disclosure requirements, while organizations face pressure to remain current on rapidly shifting executive actions and align public disclosures with material tariff and trade exposures. Supply chain accountability moved from policy to purchase order. The language around supply chain sustainability spent years living inside sustainability reports and regulatory comment periods. What changed is where it is showing up now. It is in commercial contracts. Buyers are conditioning procurement relationships on emissions documentation, forced labor compliance certifications, and supplier traceability that extends beyond Tier 1. Renewable supply chains are global, dense, and interdependent, with their performance influencing sourcing decisions, project timelines, cost certainty, and long-term delivery commitments, often unnoticed until a disruption occurs. That observation applies equally to industrial supply chains outside the energy sector. The same concentration in critical materials, the same exposure to sanctions and trade restriction shifts, the same gap between Tier 1 visibility and actual sub-tier exposure. According to Protivity's 2026 survey of 540 global board members and executives, the top investment priorities in the energy and utilities sector are infrastructure modernization at 63%, regulatory compliance infrastructure at 37%, and supply chain management at 34%. Those three priorities are not independent line items. An organization investing in infrastructure modernization without aligning its compliance infrastructure and supply chain governance is building half a system, what the convergence actually requires. The reason these pressures feel like they are landing all at once is that the underlying systems, energy procurement, compliance infrastructure, and supply chain governance, were built and managed separately inside most organizations for a long time. That separation made sense when the pressures were sequential. It does not make sense when they are simultaneous. The organizations managing this well in 2026 are not necessarily the largest or the best resourced. They are the ones that recognized early that a grid constraint is also a procurement question and a compliance question, that a supply chain documentation gap is also an energy reporting gap, that the same internal capability serves multiple obligations, and building it once is more effective than building three versions of it in three different departments under deadline. The convergence is not a temporary condition. It reflects structural changes in how energy is produced, regulated, and sourced. The organizations that adapt their governance to match that reality will spend less time managing the same pressure from three different angles. Related, what boards are asking about energy and environmental risk, how regulatory and market uncertainty is changing executive risk planning. Refinancing risk is rising for emissions-intensive companies. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.